Nintendo made waves by announcing a brand new Legend of Zelda game for the Nintendo 3DS during the most recent Nintendo Direct. And not just any Zelda, but one that, according to the creators, takes place in the same world as A Link to the Past, which is one of the most cherished Zeldas of all time. Needless to say, this is big news, and when there's big news, that usually means it's time to start up the old analysis machine and see what secrets the gameplay footage might be hiding. Now, we've already covered a lot of the game's basics in our hands-on preview videos, so make sure to check that out if you haven't already, as we'll be exploring more of the finer details here. And with that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the game takes place in the same world as A Link to the Past, and nearly every element can be traced back to that game in some way. Let's take the enemies for example. In the footage shown, we can see the return of the hard hat beetles, crows, mini Moldorms, Stalfos, turtles, and buzzblobs. And it appears you'll be battling them in the exact same ways too, right down to using a hammer on the turtles to flip them on their back, making them vulnerable. However, the trailer does show one enemy that appears to be a little different than before. If we take a look at this scene, we can see Link slice and spin attack his way through a trio of buzzblobs, which was a big no-no in A Link to the Past, as that would usually result in Link being electrocuted unless you stun them first. So either these guys lost their spark, or maybe Link's sword is immune to electric attacks. Speaking of attacks, the footage also shows off two additional items, a hammer and a bow and arrow, both of which were also featured in A Link to the Past. However, while the hammer seems nearly identical besides a slight size increase, the bow and arrow actually functions a little differently than before. For one, you can now strafe with it, making it easier to line up your shots. But more importantly, we know from our time with the demo that you no longer need to worry about running out of arrows. Instead, firing an arrow simply depletes a small portion of the meter in the bottom left corner. So what's that meter for anyway? At first glance, it appears to be a magic meter. After all, it's green, and A Link to the Past had one too. But it could also be a stamina meter, similar to Skyward Sword's, which is also green. And we think that might be the case for a couple of reasons. For one, using the hammer also causes it to deplete, despite being distinctly non-magical in appearance. And two, it also refills after just a few seconds, again like Skyward Sword. But conversely, a lack of arrows isn't something that can typically be overcome through willpower alone. And Link's new ability to turn into a drawing and follow walls, which does seem rather magical, also causes it to drain. So I could see that meter really going either way. Now, speaking of Link's new ability to turn into a drawing, did you ever notice his drawing form bears a strong resemblance to his depiction shown off at the beginning of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker? It's a neat little callback that really shows the game's attention to detail. And while we're on the topic of Link's appearance, you might have noticed that he looks very similar to the official artwork for A Link to the Past, instead of the Wind Waker model used in the previous DS games. Which makes sense, provided it takes place in the same world. But upon closer inspection, we can see that Nintendo's actually basing his appearance on the updated version of that same Link from Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, which is evidenced by his white stockings, brown sleeves, and the yellow band around his hat. So clearly Nintendo really wasn't kidding when they said the game takes place in the same world. And we can see further proof of this in the clips of the Overworld, which showcases an area that's nearly identical to one from A Link to the Past. If we compare the two side by side, you can see they share the exact same general layouts, including tree placement, similar enemy locations, and flower patches on the ground. Hell, even the division between sections where the screen scrolls appears to be very similar. But not quite everything's identical. The signposts are missing, the tree stumps have been rearranged, and there are now a lot more bushes. And that's not all. If we take a look at the path leading into the Death Mountain Cave, we can see the large stone blocking the path has been replaced by two smaller ones. Although this isn't really a big change, it does hint at a couple of things. For one, the larger stones probably aren't in the game at all, otherwise why replace them? But more importantly, it basically confirms the Power Glove is back, which is an item in A Link to the Past that you needed in order to pick up and move those exact stones.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
So that about covers everything that aren't the same besides the addition of some jars, but it's actually some of the things that are the same that's actually more interesting. Let's take a look at the clip of the house here. Now if you played A Link to the Past, then you might recognize this house as belonging to a pair of lumberjacks. The same lumberjacks who spent much of the game trying to saw down the nearby tree. Even though they never quite completed their goal, Link could finish the job for them by revisiting the tree later in the game and dashing into it, which would knock it down and reveal an entrance to a secret area. So the fact that the tree is still standing might suggest that Zelda 3DS takes place before the events in A Link to the Past. Or maybe the tree just grew back or something. But there is something else that might be a little bit more concrete. As he pointed out earlier, Link also encounters buzzblobs in this area, just as he did in A Link to the Past. Well, sort of. You see, after Link reached the Dark World, those buzzblobs mysteriously vanished from that area and were never seen there again. So the fact that they're flourishing here once again might actually support the idea that the game takes place before A Link to the Past. But, and this is a big but, Bill Trendon from Nintendo recently confirmed that the game does actually take place after A Link to the Past, which could mean one of a few things. For one, that we're looking way too deep into this, which is entirely possible. Or maybe it means time travel is involved in some way, which of course is nothing new to the Zelda series. Perhaps the game actually does start after the events of A Link to the Past, but maybe Link at some point has to travel back in time to an earlier period. It would certainly give new meaning to the title, A Link to the Past. Or maybe this world is an alternate dimension. After all, A Link to the Past already explored this concept by having both a light and dark world. What's one more? Okay, that's enough about when the game takes place. Let's get back to the where. If we take a quick look at the world map here from A Link to the Past, you can see the highlighted area here is where all of the overworld scenes in the Zelda 3DS footage take place. Yep, it's just a small chunk of a big world, assuming the rest of it is here too, of course. But what about all those indoor scenes? Yeah, we know they're all from the same temple because we played it, but is that temple actually located in the same world? And if it is, where would it be located? We don't know for sure, but we think we have an idea. Based on the gameplay footage and our time with the game, that temple is actually a pretty tall tower, and you have to climb it floor by floor to reach the boss, which is a giant worm. If that sounds familiar, that's probably because A Link to the Past also had a temple that was a tower, called the Tower of Hera. And if we compare the two, we can see they share many of the same elements. They both place an emphasis on the blue and red switches that raise and lower barriers. You can easily fall from one floor to another. They share many of the same enemies, such as mini Moldorms, Stalfos, hard-hat beetles, and flying floor tiles. Even the large bumpers return. And as I alluded to before, they both have the exact same boss, Moldorm, complete with a nearly identical arena right down to the hole on the left side. Yep, the evidence is pretty convincing. And so we can't help but wonder if the tower also shows up in the same place, on Death Mountain. Although we're not quite sure how to explain why the tower's layout is different, though it might lend credence to the alternate dimension idea. Now in A Link to the Past, the Tower of Hera was the third temple, so it popped up pretty early into the game. And we think it might show up pretty early in Zelda 3DS as well, since Link only has 3 items in his inventory. Now historically, Link has collected one major item per temple, and since Link currently has 2 such items, being the bow and arrow and hammer, that would peg this one at also being the third temple. But there's just one problem. When we played through the temple, we didn't find a single new item for our inventory. That might actually suggest that the discovery of key quest items have been divorced from the temples, which would be an interesting change. Maybe you'll find all the items you need in the overworld now, and thus the temples you can visit would be dependent on what items you have. Speaking of items, we took a look at the new inventory screen while playing through the demo and noticed I had room for 20 items, which is the exact same amount as in, you guessed it, A Link to the Past. At least it is if we ignore the subscreen for bottles. Now every item shown off so far, such as the bow and arrow, hammer, and a bottle filled with life medicine are also from that game. And of course, we already mentioned the power glove is likely to return as well, so we can't help but wonder what other items might also be returning. Okay, we're just about done here, but as usual, there's just a couple of final details left. For one, there's just a few final returning elements that I wanted to point out. Of course, fairies are back, but in that same clip, we can see that exit portals are too. And speaking of portals, we noticed that one appeared about halfway through the temple that would allow us to quickly travel back and forth from the entrance, which is a mechanic that was first seen in Link's Awakening. So yes, A Link to the Past isn't the only Zelda game that Zelda 3DS takes ideas from. Finally, if we pause this clip right here, we can get a close-up look at Link's shield. And it really allows us to appreciate the finer details. Ah, who am I kidding, there are almost no details there aside from 2 small protrusions. And this lack of detail is highly unusual, as Link's shields, even the starter ones, usually have some sort of design. But maybe it's bare for a reason. What if you can upgrade it in some way, similar to Skyward Sword? We also noticed that it has the exact same shape as the Hylian shield from A Link to the Past. And maybe it's just us, but don't those 2 protrusions and the red decorations on the Hylian shield seem to be positioned pretty similarly? It sure seems like they're related in some way. And with that, we're done covering everything we could dig up on the new Zelda 3DS game. As usual, let us know if we missed anything by posting in the comments. Thanks for watching, and make sure to keep an eye on GameXplain.com for more on Zelda 3DS and other things gaming too.